All right, welcome into this Thursday, February 26th edition of Freightonomics. And I'm Zach Strickland, head of Freight Market Intelligence. Thomas Wasson joining me here today. We got a lot to break down. The title of today's show, Turbulent Times. I don't know, I could have called it Freight Chaos. That might have been a little bit more catchy, but you know, we're in this period of time. The freight market, domestic trucking market specifically, is experiencing a lingering influence of what many people would allocate to the winter weather event, which was now 4 weeks ago. Winter Storm Fern landed in Nashville around January 22nd. We're February 26th. And we've got tender rejection rates that are still high. We've got spot rates that are still high. And then, of course, we've got this surrounding narrative that we're going to talk about today around tariffs. Obviously, a big deal. A big deal, or are they no deal at the same time? And then, of course, we've got regulatory commentary that I think may be one of the more important things. So I want to make sure that we get to that at the end of today's show. So Thomas Wasson, you know, it's been a month since you've been on.
It has. Do you like my new freight dance? I was practicing a little bit.
I mean, I don't know. Yes, it was great. So the thing to get going with here, I think, you know, you worked in freight for a long period of time. You're a data guy too. What's your big takeaways from this market right now? Like, this is, I think, big debate online is this a sustainable flip or not? What's your hot take?
Hot take right now is, so it should have gone down, but it's not. And so after, you know, the first week of February, I was thinking to myself, well, surely we would start to see some seasonal downward ticks because we had the winter weather event. Winter weather is a good catalyst. And then it kind of simmers down. The only thing I can explain, because like you said, dueling narratives, and this is my spicy take, what should have been structural, we know structurally capacity is tightening, but now we're running on vibes and opportunism. We have a little behavioral psychology because, you know, it's like a dam bursting. Once the tender ejections reach a certain part and the routing guides begin to fail, the genie is out of the bottle. Now, whether factually in the realm of facts, it should have gone down. Demand is lower when we look at CLAV. When we're looking at imports, we're looking at all of this stuff, but now it is being driven on pure vibes, folks. And I think the vibes alone are going to be the early signals, the catalyst of this next upcycle, because whenever you're on the spot market, and if I get the feeling I can get $200 more, I'm not just going to go back and say, yeah, no, I'll go to 200 less when I'm like trying to stave off a bankruptcy.
Yeah, I mean, now the emotional component is compounded by the fact that you have been, from a carrier standpoint, really struggling financially for a while. The brokerage.
Hope is a dangerous drug.
Oh, man. Well, let's give some people some data to give some visualization to what we're talking about here, and I will go into it. If you want to count me in on a market in two.
Down. Let's do it. All right, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Starting with the 5, teasing the people. So STRI, Sonar Tender or Truckload Rejection Index here. The higher this gets, the tighter the market is. I cannot put into words to express how weird this motion is in the tender rejection index. This is traditionally the type of movement we see in a COVID-esque environment. Not to say that we're all the way back up there. The average tender rejection rate during COVID was around 21, 22%. We are currently hovering around this 13% mark, and it's struggling to come down. Normally, when we have disruptive events during the last 3 years, it's a very quick up, and then we fairly quickly come back down. We are not seeing that. You see this resistance to falling from this index, and we are significantly higher than we were this time last year when we were seeing some demand-side conditions weaken. So let's go to the next chart. Break this down into modes. One of the biggest breakout moments, I just wrote a chart of the week about this. If you want to go check it out on FreightWaves.com. Flatbed tender rejection rates now up around 45%. This is insane. Flatbed does not represent a huge portion of the tender data, but this is a very consistent flatbed sector. This is manufacturing. This is that salt of the earth freight that is going to move all year long. The spot market, of course, holds a lot of flatbed activity. But the fact that we are seeing tender data really take off from the flatbed sector a little ahead of schedule is a big deal. Refrigerated van, both sticky. Do not discount the fact that they are below the flatbed side because they are representing far more volume in this data set. Let's go to the next one. Talk about volume a little bit. STVI popping back up. We are seeing some demand side component. No, we are not blowing up on the demand side because there's rejected tenders in this index, but the fact that we are directionally seeing this movement is something to watch. Last but not least, let's talk about the spot rates here and talk about flatbed, refrigerated, dry van, all staying very, very high. And we are
cooking. We're cooking with gas.
We're a long way away from any winter weather outside. You know, we just have a nor'easter up in the Northeast, but that's whenever we have winter weather in the Northeast, it's kind of like it really needs to cook. And it did. I think we had 3 feet in Providence, Rhode Island, dumped in a single day. That's a big deal, but Providence, Rhode Island, not a huge freight origination area. We see far more disruption from winter weather when we're talking about Texas, Ohio, Chicago, this kind of central freight hub market areas. Atlanta, of course, if you get an inch of snow down there, that's a disruptive event.
Yeah.
But we're pretty far gone from any kind of significant, what I would say, weather disruptive event that's going to stop anybody from doing anything. I think even in Providence, there was an image on the Weather Channel where their interstates were completely clear the next day.
Yeah, just to illustrate New York, 2 feet, that's all right, just a Tuesday. And so the flatbed one, pull back up that chart on flatbed. I just want to illustrate, because I did open deck as a freight broker back in the day. I dabbled in the flatbed. One of the big things to think about is flatbed is like a canary in the coal mine for industrials. Remember we had the tariffs with the wood and the trees and stuff? Yeah. Well, we saw flatbed popping out in the P&W in certain areas when we started having that early tariff. Metals and other things are some of the things to keep an eye out for. 40% is wild because in the winter, normally demand for flatbed, work sites shut down. You're not building as many houses in the cold. Winter weather has job site disruptions. Exactly. Road construction is disrupted. How the heck are we this high? That is one of the early signals. The dog that's not barking is when we're seeing other modes popping off outside of van. That's going to mean that, there's something more to this. Something has legs here.
Yeah, and flatbed, of course, a kind of a bellwether for the manufacturing and construction segments that we used to talk about quite a bit here. I think the eyes are on this index too from that perspective. It's a way that we're really expecting manufacturing to kind of have a little bit of a renaissance this year. Construction, maybe not so much.
And I think the renaissance is structural because with nearshoring as well, the raw materials are getting closer. Supply chains, we should continue to see manufacturing. Now, whether it's going to be a beautiful Venetian renaissance or the early renaissance where I learned how to write things in a book better, that is too far to tell. But if I could tell you which way the wind is blowing structurally, these supply chains, because of national security reasons, the bifurcation in the global economy with Cold War 2.0 with China, we are going to continue to see domestic manufacturing move into the U.S. as a pillar of our national security strategy. And so supply chains are now a politicized element, similar to back when we were fighting the old USSR in the 80s. So, hey, Throwback Thursday.
There you go. All right, let's talk about a little bit of economic activity. We had a GDP reading come out 1.4% this past few weeks ago. We're going to have another revision here, a more updated version here in a few weeks. But 1.4%, I don't want to make too much of this. We got a 1-ish% drag on that figure based on the fact that the government was shut down. That will get baked back in. I remember one of our former economists would talk about how normally you recover a lot of that GDP growth in the subsequent sector or the subsequent quarters. So I'm not too concerned about that. I think if it were a 2.5% figure, as a lot of people, that's a pretty good figure. And a lot of it's coming, though, from that services side of the equation. And I almost want to just wipe GDP out of last year entirely because of the fluctuation in import activity, really screwing with that figure. Hopefully this year we can actually make more sense of GDP figures. Now, let's go into the tariff discussion, as we just had the Supreme Court rule that the IEEPA tariffs were illegally implemented. What does that mean? There's a whole swath of articles that you can read. This is one of them on FreightWaves.com. Here's my concise take on it is the Trump administration is not going to let this die. There are a few other mechanisms in place, both almost as legally fragile as the IEEPA tariffs were. The Section 301s would be one of them. He's got a 122 that's kind of temporarily in place right now that only can last for 150 days. I think it's 15% from the last report. It was implemented at 10%. Then he raised it to 15%. Again, the absolute numbers are going to be muted compared to what he could do prior to the IEEPA ruling. And I think that is the important factor here, is that you can no longer see the grenade being thrown into these countries. So people can kind of settle in, which I think, looking at the IOTI, and again, this is a little early. We're looking at import container orders coming from all over the world into the United States. We're in the middle of the Lunar New Year.
You're the horse. Shout out to my Chinese homies.
Again, Lunar New Year ended, but in terms of the shipping pattern, we're troughing out right about now over where imports would kind of die off. So this ruling came at really a time where we can't make any odds or ends over what shippers are really thinking about this. And I think my read right now is that shippers are really just kind of inoculated to any more news until somebody says something definitively and says, look, this is going to not be messed with anymore. Nobody really can make sense of the administration's true policy in terms of like where they're going to stop trying to push things, whether or not you agree with their end. We just talked about the manufacturing sector as being kind of a primary component of this. We're trying to, enforce things for national security reasons, all sorts of things that we're trying to kind of pull back and reduce our dependence on international, business, which a lot of these are American companies just operating internationally. So we have to keep that in mind. It is a very complicated machine that we're dealing with. But right now, imports, we're down year over year and year over year over year. But guess what? Those were two overheated years.
I got a story for you about that.
Let's go.
So a place out of Pennsylvania. I learned this from the Warhammer minifigure community. There was a place that made a certain resin putty to use in models. Mm-hmm. It was in the U.S., but it got its resin from China. It is now going out of business because of the tariffs. Even though the finished products were made in the U.S., the green putty, the green stuff they called it, they imported it all from parts of overseas, and they had the finished product. And so when we're thinking of, like you said, examples of where the blowback and the impacts, which makes it hard for us to figure out whether this is going to be an industrial renaissance or not, is that when the raw materials got tariffed to tar with like 200, 300%, it made it to where those guys could no longer economically do it. And so now a European company in England is actually doing it, and they're going to be, so we're going to see some multinational, transnational shifts. But unfortunately for parts of the model making and the hobby communities and stuff, that's going to be one of the little examples of how we're seeing it. And one of the things I want to look at with the Trump tariffs, the most important thing to remember from a shipper standpoint is that you have to be prepared for like 15 to 25. You have to have a contingency plan. I'm going to use a term called the OODA loop, observe, orient, decide, and act. The administration at Trump 2.0 is the most aggressive in throwing out OODA loops. Supreme Court decided that 201's not good. Well, I got 155. I got 175. I got some more three-digit numbers. Okay, well, like FedEx, let's try to get this back in court. Good luck. 3 years later, maybe you'll finally get it. You spend enough legal fees. This is by design. So when we're looking at the impacts of the tariffs, I want folks to understand this is going to be a structural reality from a supply chain and demand planning standpoint. Don't be like the poor guys who make their stuff in Pennsylvania. You have to have backup areas. You have to have backup vendors. And so when we're starting to think about the raw materials, tying it all back into flatbed and open deck as well, when we are considering the raw material inputs that drive these American companies who mostly like to finish goods in the U.S., we don't really do raw stuff anymore. It's going to be a challenge, and you need to have as a baseline, what is your worst case scenario? So at the very least, you're happily surprised you're not as screwed as you thought you were.
Well said. So a few of the I think the bottom line is that tariffs are here to stay, or some version of them is here to stay for the next 3 years. 122, Section 122 is now in place with the 15% tariff. That is only going to be used for 150 days. Congress then has the ability to make it permanent. What the Section 122 tariff is really only supposed to be used in the concept of payments imbalance. So it has nothing to do with long-term structural changes. This is simply, hey, we need you to catch up on your payments, which isn't going to be challenged right now because it lasts too short of a period of time. The Supreme Court just took 8-9 months to rule on this. There's no point in going through legal channels here. This is simply a stopgap for this administration to try to get these tariffs kind of as they search for other avenues. I mentioned the 301 tariffs, and the 232s are also an option. 301s are simply there to that's probably the most viable because it targets unfair trading practices. This is already in place for a couple of countries or commodities. 232 is a national security threat. And of course, Stuart Charles writes an article about some of these things. Importers face tough decisions after tariff ruling, trying to figure out which commodities are more likely to be targeted by 301s and 232s is probably the best avenue to go about. The 232, the 301, which is the unfair trade practice thing, is probably the most broadly applicable item. So definitely be focusing on that one. National security is already in place for aluminum and steel, which both have a 10 and 25% tariff respectively. That's going to be challenged legally by several companies if the administration chooses to do so with some of those commodities. So tariffs aren't going away. We're still going to have confusion and uncertainty here. I think businesses are just they've already kind of adapted to a 17% aggregate tariff. Now it's come down to about a 13, 14% aggregate tariff. So there's a little bit of relief here, but I don't think we're changing a ton.
Speaking of national security, let's talk about what the heck has been going on in Mexico.
Yeah.
Especially, we had some recent cartel-related violence. They had taken out one of the leaders of one of the larger cartels. I think we got the thing up there. Yeah, there we go. And so when we're looking at the broader terms of nearshoring, looking at our trade partners, Mexico being the largest, Canada coming in second place, of course, how does that impact when the very trade partners you have can be rapidly destabilized with one surgical strike?
Yeah, I think the big debate here, Thomas, is whether or not this is kind of a superficial move. I mean, El Mencho was in charge for 20 plus years.
Yep.
This is a huge deal. This is a huge deal. He's one of the largest drug lords in history, or longest tenured as well. Obviously, this doesn't eradicate the drug trade. Yeah. It certainly doesn't eradicate the instability in Mexico, which causes a lot of companies heartburn about trying to invest in this untapped country full of a lot of opportunity. We also have USMCA that's coming up for review here in a few months that have some companies also concerned. So my question here is this something that President Sheinbaum is trying to use in response to the Trump administration's kind of ongoing message around fentanyl and drug flow? And is this a more structural shift that is actually going to help open up Mexico to production activity?
I think it will, because I think the security situation has to be addressed. And the challenge is the reason the cartels are thriving is because the central government cannot really control those northern border regions. And so in the vacuum of a lack of centralized power, because the Mexican government, unfortunately, is really focused around Mexico City and a few other areas, you have these other groups coming in. I mean, the same thing with the mob in Italy. The reason you had the mob, well, the Italians couldn't get, the central government was in the north, a little bit of Rome, and down south it was wild man's country. And so when we're looking at that from a broader geopolitical thing, I would continue to expect the Trump administration to put pressure on Mexico, at least to get the cartels at a point where you're trying to work on reducing the amount of fentanyl precursors. And there's also there's an aspect of Chinese multinationals who are dumping the raw materials and laundering them through Mexican cartels, because unfortunately Americans, and if you ask the Mexicans, they're going to blame us, because they're like, look, you guys are addicted to drugs and guns. We're just filling it in. Don't hate me, bro. I'm trying to make a living. And so we do have some structural issues. I think Mexico is going to be a punching bag, but at the same time, there's a lot of opportunities. Using the C word with cartels, most of the time these guys are in business. They are mostly business focused. And so please, nobody send me nasty grams. I'm sure we can work something out.
Yeah, so cross-border traffic did kind of pull back slightly last year, but that's on the heels of record growth in 23 and 24. We did see some inbound traffic take a step back. That could have also been structural due to a lot of the automotive sector having to take a little bit of a pause. We had tariff stuff going on too, so there's a little bit of noise in the cross-border traffic. I am a little bit more, I don't know about this, if this is the year that we see that trend reverse, but next year, if we get some clarity around what this cartel situation actually manifests into, as well as, more importantly, the USMCA, which I think is actually the bigger story for the cross-border traffic in the coming years, as that maybe gets extended, or maybe they punt. That would be the one that I would watch. But this is certainly something that's not worth dismissing. So making sure we get to the regulatory behavior stuff for this market, because I think this is probably some of the most important for anyone watching that has an interest in truckload transportation or transportation in general, domestically. These are going to be very critical for you to understand and watch. We have several things going on.
Yep.
And of course, for those of you that watch State of the Union, President Trump brought up the Delilah law, where this little girl was hit by an immigrant with no documentation. They weren't here legally. What this could potentially lead to, as Senator Banks is proposing a law that says that only U.S. citizens, documented U.S. citizens, can get a CDL.
Which is big.
Which is huge. And Craig Fuller, our CEO, writes this article. You highly recommend go read it. Estimated to be around 600,000 drivers, or 16% of the total driver population, based on something that industry economist Noel Perry put out back last year when a lot of this was going on. This could be a dramatic impact. And one of the reasons we're seeing tender rejection sticky is because there's been ELD enforcement, there's been English language proficiency enforcement, there's been CDL mill enforcement stuff.
And bankruptcies. So it's all combined.
Capacity is outnumbered right now. If you are a trucking operator, the deck has been against you for 3+ years more, if you're talking about regulatory behavior. And I highly recommend also the Rob Carpenter article. This guy who writes for FreightWaves kills it. It is the great ELD CDL swindle that downgraded U.S. trucking. He goes into massive detail and he crushes all the reasoning. A lot of this stuff, ironically, as he, I think, accurately points out, is a byproduct of ATA and lobbying practices that were built by these larger carriers and larger fleets in trying to attack this driver shortage concept, which is really a recruiting issue.
Yeah, it's a shortage for them because if you're running a slaughterhouse and you ain't got enough pigs, you're going to say there's a pig shortage, and then you can't get your bacon. And so I think Rob and Craig both are really hitting the nail on the head. We're going through some structural changes that haven't been seen since the 1980s. There's two ways to change trucking. Either you figure out demand happens and you suddenly need more trucks, or you crack down on the availability of trucks and make it more difficult for them. And so one of the big things I think with when we're looking at the Trump admin of the State of the Union, what makes that so unique is because he tagged a person's name and he's doing a bill. I spoke with some FMCSA people who used to work there. There's 3 ways to get it. Congress does it, the FMCSA does it themselves via the DOT, or the executive or the president says, I really want this, make it happen. So what's fascinating is this is an example of an executive seeing there's money on the table. The Trump administration politically has had trouble with sometimes with the immigrant narrative because you're rounding up dudes at Home Depot. It's much easier to pretend it's a missile on 18 wheels that's 80,000 pounds fully loaded. The optics of it makes sense why suddenly trucking is in the political limelight. My final thing for you is don't look at this through a political lens. Look at this through incentives. The reason ATA and other lobbyists needed it was they were incentivized to adjust their labor. We've had incentives in place to allow bad actors to take advantage of it. We've had loopholes. This is part of a larger effort of closing loopholes and fixing incentives. So I don't want to have political tinginess on it. I firmly believe if we move the discourse up to fixing bad incentives, I think that's the right play. Unfortunately, though, right now in this media environment, if it bleeds, it leads. And so we're going to see a lot more rabble-rousing in the meantime.
Yeah, try to get away. There's plenty of foreign-born drivers out there that do the right thing. They drive very well and safely on the roads. There's plenty of domestically born drivers out there that don't. So let's not get caught up in too much of that labeling. But the fact is that the system is set up with boundaries and rules that are there to promote safety. And if we're not doing that, that's not good.
Yeah, we haven't been enforcing our rules, and now everyone's shocked that we're suddenly enforcing the rules that we should have because now there's attention on the bad incentives.
Yeah, and life is not fair. But if you're, taking advantage of a system and you're not contributing as much as you're taking out, that's not okay. And one of the things is, if your cost of living is lower because you reside in another country and you just come into the United States, grab the money and take it home with you, that's not something economically that we really want to encourage.
Tragedy of the commons.
It happens. There's a lot of U.S. citizens that move to other countries that take advantage of that cost of living loophole, but they're U.S. citizens and they're paying taxes as well. And they're also, if they were driving in this country, they wouldn't be an uninsured motorist, more than likely, going through the system. So that there are things there that, if you're not a U.S. citizen, you're not contributing to the infrastructure and all these other things that you're taking advantage of. That's not something you want to encourage.
Yeah, at the end of the day,
any business,
we're going to see the market's going to continue to improve for carriers because we're seeing this crackdown. Whether you like it or not, there's opportunities available. I think the biggest takeaway for shippers is we got a lot of choppy waters ahead, but you just got to have a few game plans and have at least 3 in your back pocket because you never know if it's going to be best, middle, or worst.
Yeah, the big takeaway, of course, watch out. This freight market is on the verge of a probably more sustained, tightened environment. Rates are expected to increase this year. Just be ready for it. The contracts are coming up. Spot rates are already super volatile. This one could last for a minute.
Buckle up.